The quiet evening was shattered by the sound of gunfire. For a moment, everything stood still. The air grew heavy, the scent of gunpowder mingling with the fresh-cut grass. The world narrowed to one horrifying sight. King, her dog, her protector, her only family in this quiet neighborhood, lay motionless on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him. The officers stood rigid, gripping their weapons as if bracing for something far greater than the threat they had imagined. A beloved pet. Brielle Lancaster stood frozen on the porch, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. Her hands, which had spent years steadying rifles and diffusing explosives, now trembled, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, rage. King had been by her side since she left the military. He wasn't just a dog. He was a survivor like her. Trained, disciplined, loyal. He didn't lunge, didn't growl. He was the last connection to the life she had built after years in combat. The only living thing that had been with her through the worst nights, when sleep wouldn't come and memories clawed at her mind. And now he was gone. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "Why?" she demanded. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a tense jaw, spoke first. "Ma'am, we had a report of an aggressive dog." Brielle's voice sharpened. "He was on my property. He wasn't loose. He wasn't a threat." Another officer, younger and less sure of himself, hesitated. We didn't know." Her laugh was cold, humorless. "You had time to assess. You had time to see the leash. You had time to think before you pulled the trigger." The broad-shouldered officer, whose name tag read as Wilcox, exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but this was a misunderstanding. A mistake." Brielle's eyes locked onto his. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. That word, meant to smooth everything over, to turn this moment into an unfortunate accident, only fueled her rage. Mistakes had consequences. Mistakes meant King was lying in front of her, his body still warm, his chest rising for the last time before going still forever. Somewhere down the street, porch lights flicked on. Neighbors stepped out, curious but cautious, some already reaching for their phones to record the scene. Wilcox cleared his throat. "We can file a report." Brielle's voice dropped lower. "Dangerous. You think I give a damn about a report?" The other officers shifted uneasily. Something about her presence unsettled them, though they couldn't name it yet. But Brielle knew. She had seen men like them before, young, confident, armed, believing the weight of their badge made them untouchable. She took a step forward, slow and deliberate. Wilcox stiffened, his hand twitching near his holster. "You should leave," Brielle said, her voice quiet but commanding. Another officer, one with nervous eyes, whispered, "Come on, man. Let's go." Wilcox hesitated, then jerked his head toward the patrol car. The officers retreated, leaving behind nothing but the stench of gunpowder and the mess they had made. Brielle stood there, watching their car disappear down the street, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding. They thought this was over, but it wasn't. They had no idea who they had just crossed, but they were about to find out. Brielle didn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor of her living room, King's collar in her hands, staring at the door as if waiting for him to walk through it. But he wouldn't. His water bowl was still half full, his leash still hanging by the door. The house felt empty, in a way it never had before. But grief wasn't new to her. She'd lost people before, friends, brothers in arms, soldiers who never made it home. She knew how to compartmentalize, how to push through. This wasn't combat, but it was war. At dawn, she showered, dressed, and walked out the door with a purpose. The local precinct wasn't far, and she didn't bother calling ahead. When she stepped inside, the room went still for half a second. Officers and clerks paused mid-task, their eyes flicking to the woman who had just entered as if she didn't belong. But she did. Brielle walked straight to the desk sergeant, a stout man with thinning hair and an air of disinterest. His nameplate read A. Mathis. "I need to speak to your commanding officer," she said. Mathis barely looked up. "You'll need to file a formal complaint." Brielle placed her palms on the counter, leaning in slightly. That wasn't a request. Now he looked up, his expression shifting just a flicker. There was something about her that made people sit up a little straighter, listen a little closer. Still, he reached for a form and slid it across the counter. You can fill this out. Brielle's voice was firm. I'm not here to fill out paperwork. I'm here for answers. Mathis sighed, shifting his weight. Look, lady, I don't know what you think marching in here is going to do, but mistakes happen. It's unfortunate, but Brielle's fingers curled into a fist. She took a breath. What's your protocol for discharging a firearm on private property? He hesitated. Your officers enter my yard and kill my dog without cause. That's reckless discharge of a weapon and destruction of property. At the minimum, if they fired near pedestrians, it could be criminal negligence. You want to tell me again that this was just a mistake? Mathis swallowed. A door opened in the back, and a voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? The man who stepped forward was in his 50s, graying at the temples, but still built like a man who had seen action once. His uniform bore the name Captain Richard Holbrook. Brielle turned to him. You tell me. Holbrook studied her. He wasn't dismissive like the others. He took in the way she stood, the way she held his gaze. Come with me, he said. She followed him into a glass-walled office. He gestured to a chair, but she didn't sit. Holbrook exhaled through his nose. You want an apology? Brielle tilted her head. I want accountability. He leaned back. I reviewed the report this morning. The officers responded to a call about a dangerous animal. They made a judgment call. It wasn't personal. Brielle almost laughed. Not personal? You mean the way they looked at me afterward, like I was the problem? That wasn't personal? Holbrook didn't flinch. I understand your anger, but these things happen. There was again that phrase, that excuse. Brielle's jaw tensed. I'm not going away. I want the body cam footage. I want a full investigation. Holbrook sighed. You know how this works. Internal affairs will review it, and if there was misconduct, we'll handle it. Brielle leaned forward slightly. That's not good enough. He tapped his pen on the desk, thinking. Look, Lancaster, Captain Holbrook, she interrupted, her voice cold. I served 20 years, 4 tours overseas. I know what actual threats look like. I know what fear looks like. Your officers weren't scared of my dog. They were trigger happy. Holbrook's expression darkened. I can't let you come in here making accusations. Then do something about it. She shot back. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Then he straightened. File your complaint. That's the process. Brielle exhaled through her nose. He wasn't going to budge. Not yet. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Captain, she said, her voice steady, I suggest you handle this now, before it gets out of your control. And then she walked out. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Brielle expected resistance. She had spent too much time in bureaucratic circles to believe justice would come easily. But she wasn't prepared for what came next. The first sign was subtle, the feeling of being watched. It started the evening after her visit to the precinct. A black, unmarked SUV parked 2 houses down. A man inside pretended to scroll through his phone. She knew the look. He wasn't waiting for someone. He was observing. She tested her theory, walking outside, taking out her trash, standing on her porch a little longer than necessary. The man barely moved, but she caught it, the flicker of his gaze when she shifted. She smiled to herself. They were already making mistakes. The second sign came the next morning. She opened her mailbox to find a plain white envelope, no return address, no postage. Inside, one sentence printed in bold black letters. Drop it. No signature. No threats of violence. Just 2 words. She exhaled, folding the paper neatly before tucking it into her back pocket. So, this was how they wanted to play it. Fine. She grabbed her car keys and drove to the law office of Jared Whitmore, an old brick building that had seen better days. But Brielle didn't care about appearances. She cared that Whitmore won cases. When she stepped into his office, he looked up from his desk, eyes narrowing slightly before recognition dawned. Brielle Lancaster, he said, leaning back in his chair. Been a long time. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need your help. Whitmore steepled his fingers. Let me guess, This is about the police." She tossed a letter onto his desk. He glanced at it, then back at her. That was fast. "She's Saturday. They don't want this getting out." Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temple. "You know what you're up against, right? Police departments cover for their own. Internal affairs is a joke. Even if I take this to court, we're looking at years before anything sticks. If anything sticks at all." Brielle studied him. "You afraid?" He chuckled dryly. "I'm a lawyer, Bree. I don't have the luxury of being afraid." She leaned forward. "Then let's make their lives hell." Whitmore exhaled, tapping his desk. "All right, first step. We file an official request for body cam footage. They'll try to stonewall us, claim it's under review. But if they deny it outright, that's our opening." Brielle nodded. "And if they refuse?" His smile was sharp. "Then we remind them that the court of public opinion is just as powerful as a courtroom." That night, she walked King's usual route out of habit, past the row of houses, the quiet sidewalks. The town felt smaller than ever. She was halfway home when headlights appeared. A car slowed beside her, windows tinted too dark to see inside. It matched her pace. She didn't break stride, didn't look over. Then the passenger window slid down, and a voice, low and smooth, spoke. "Walk away, Lancaster." Brielle kept moving. The car kept rolling. "Don't be stupid. File your little report, take the settlement, and let it go." She finally stopped, turning her head slightly. "That's supposed to scare me?" A chuckle. "No, it's supposed to warn you." She stared into the darkness of the car. "You already made your mistake." Silence. Then, "Oh yeah?" She tilted her head. "Yeah, you should have shot me, not my dog." The car idled for a second longer. Then the window slid up and it drove away. Brielle stood there, watching until the taillights disappeared. Now it was personal. Brielle wasn't just angry. She was calculating. They wanted her to walk away, to disappear into paperwork and bureaucracy, to accept their mistake as an unfortunate incident. But they had underestimated who they were dealing with. By morning, she had a plan. The first move was pressure, legal, media, and community. Whitmore had already filed a request for the body cam footage, but Brielle knew they'd stall. So she made her next call to Danny Ortega, a local journalist with a reputation for sniffing out corruption like blood in the water. She met Danny at a diner off the highway, one of those places with cracked vinyl booze and coffee that tasted like burnt regret. Danny sipped her coffee, eyes sharp over the rim. "You sure about this, Bree? Once we go public, there's no turning back." Brielle leaned in. "They've already threatened me. That was their mistake." Danny set her cup down. "Okay, then let's make them regret it." By midday, the first article dropped. "Local woman demands justice after officers shoot her dog without cause. Department refuses to release footage." It spread fast. The headline alone had people talking. But Brielle wasn't done. The second move was exposure. If the police wouldn't hand over footage, she'd force them into a corner. She took to social media, posting a photo of King alongside a short caption. "My name is Brielle Lancaster. My dog was shot in front of me by officers who never even checked to see if he was a threat. I have asked for body cam footage. They won't release it. Ask yourself why." It wasn't long before the comments poured in. Some were predictable. People defend the officers, claiming she was making it about race or that police have a hard job. But the overwhelming majority wanted answers. A local activist group reached out, offering support. A former cop messaged her privately, warning her to watch her back. Then came the third move, direct pressure on the department. She went back to the station, this time not alone. A small group had gathered outside, neighbors, reporters, even a few strangers who had read her story. Whitmore was already there, arms crossed, waiting. As soon as she stepped inside, Captain Holbrook was there to greet her, but there was no welcome in his expression. "You made quite the spectacle," he said, his voice low. Brielle didn't blink. "Then give me what I asked for." Holbrook sighed, rubbing his temple. "Lancaster, I told you. You told me to file a complaint." "I did. You told me to go through the proper channels." "I did," she said, taking a step closer. "Now, I'm telling you, I'm not waiting anymore. Holbrook's eyes flicked past her toward the small crowd outside. He wasn't stupid. He knew this was spiraling beyond his control. He exhaled sharply. Give me 48 hours. Brielle's jaw tensed. You've already had time. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You keep pushing like this, you're going to make enemies you don't want. She smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Already have. She turned and walked out, leaving him standing there. But she wasn't waiting for their decision. She was about to make hers. Brielle had learned long ago that when people stalled, it wasn't because they needed time. It was because they were hiding something, and she was done waiting. 48 hours passed. No footage, no answers, just silence. But silence was an answer, too. It meant they were scrambling. It meant they were afraid. That night, she parked 2 blocks away from the precinct, dressed in dark jeans and a jacket that concealed more than just a cold. She moved through the side streets like she had done in places far more dangerous than this. The security cameras weren't a problem. She had studied the angles during her last visit. She approached the side entrance, pulled her phone from her pocket, and made the call. Whitmore, she said when he answered, his voice groggy. I need you to get a judge on the phone. There was a pause. Bree, it's almost midnight. Then wake them up, she replied. Another pause and a sigh. What are you about to do? She didn't answer. The side door opened, just like she expected. Officer Marcus Givens, a rookie who still had the naive belief that good cops existed in bad systems, had reached out to her earlier that day with short text. I wasn't there that night, but I heard things. They're covering something up. I can help. Now. He stood in the shadows, looking over his shoulder before stepping aside to let her in. You have 10 minutes, he whispered. If they catch you in here, I don't know you. She nodded. You never did. Givens led her through the dimly lit hallway, past empty desks and silent radios. He stopped outside a locked door. The footage is in there, he said. They pulled it from the system. Probably thought you'd never get this far. Brielle pulled a small device from her pocket, an old military trick, a portable signal disruptor. She pressed a button, cutting off security feeds in a 5-minute window. Givens handed her a key card. You've got to hurry. She swiped the card, and the door clicked open. Inside, rows of monitors lined the walls, a server humming softly in the background. She moved quickly, scanning labels until she found it. Incident Report 7-4-5-6, Lancaster residence. She inserted a flash drive, downloading the file. The progress bar crawled forward. Come on, she muttered. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Givens tensed. Someone's coming. The download hit 100% just as the door handle turned. Brielle ejected the drive, slipping it into her pocket. Givens moved first. Captain, he said, stepping into the doorway, blocking her from view. Holbrook's voice was low, tired. What are you doing here, Givens? Just finishing up some paperwork. Givens replied. Silence. Then, you seen Lancaster lately? Brielle's fingers curled into a fist. Givens hesitated. Not since she came by earlier. Holbrook didn't answer right away. Then he sighed. Go home, kid. A beat of silence, then the sound of retreating footsteps. Brielle exhaled slowly. She slipped past Givens and down the hall, moving quickly but smoothly. No sudden movements, no hesitation. She stepped into the night air just as Whitmore called back. I got your judge, he said. What do you have? Brielle slid into her car, staring at the flash drive in her hand. Everything, she replied. And now it's time to finish this. Brielle sat in her car, the weight of the flash drive in her palm. This wasn't just about King anymore. It wasn't just about her. This was about power, who had it, who abused it, and who they thought they could silence. But they had chosen the wrong woman. She didn't drive home. She drove straight to Danny Ortega's apartment. When Danny opened the door, she was already dressed, coffee in hand, like she had been waiting for this moment. Tell me you have something, Danny said. Brielle walked in, tossing the flash drive onto the counter. See for yourself. Danny plugged it into her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Then the video played. They watched in silence. The footage showed it all. The officers arriving at her house. The way Wilcox barely looked at King before pulling the trigger. No warning, no hesitation. And worst of all, the seconds afterward when they realized their mistake, but never once tried to help. Then came the part that made Brielle's stomach turn. The moment Wilcox looked at his partner and muttered, "We'll say it charged. No one will question it." A deliberate cover-up. Danny exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her mouth. Jesus. Brielle's hands curled into fists. They knew. They always knew. Danny nodded, already grabbing her phone. "I'm running this now." The story broke by sunrise. Body cam footage exposes officer-involved shooting cover-up, police fabricated report. The response was immediate. Social media erupted. News outlets picked it up. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding justice. Brielle stood in the crowd, watching as Captain Holbrook stepped onto the station steps, looking like a man who had lost control of the fire he tried to contain. He cleared his throat, addressing the press. "The department is launching an internal investigation." "Too late for that," Danny muttered beside Brielle. Holbrook shifted, visibly uncomfortable. "Officer Wilcox has been placed on administrative leave, pending arrest." "Him!" someone in the crowd shouted. Brielle didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth had already done its damage. Then Whitmore stepped forward, his voice carrying over the noise. "Captain, let me remind you that falsifying a police report and obstructing justice are criminal offenses. And since we've already sent this footage to the state attorney's office, I suggest you act fast." Holbrook swallowed hard. The pressure was working. And by that evening, Wilcox was in handcuffs. Brielle stood in her backyard that night, staring at the empty spot where King used to sit. Justice had been served, but it wasn't victory. Nothing could bring King back. Nothing could erase the pain. But maybe, just maybe, it meant the next time something like this happened, the system would think twice before protecting the guilty. Danny's voice broke the silence behind her. "What now?" Brielle took a deep breath. "Now, I make sure they don't do this to anyone else." Danny smirked. "You thinking about a new career?" Brielle let out a dry laugh. "Let's just say I'm not done fighting." She turned, walking inside, because there was always another battle, and this time she'd make sure they saw her coming. Your voice matters. Speak up, fight back, and never let them tell you to walk away. If you believe in justice, subscribe for more stories that hold power accountable.